Good morning, this is Ben, and if you are a Christian and you wonder why talk about proof and disproof of your Christian faith, if you wonder why do apologetics, if you want to know what's the point of any of that, I made a video for you. It's this video. We think of apologetics as words offered to help someone change his or her mind. But the problem is this leads to epistemology, and people have a problem with epistemology, especially Christians. They don't like epistemology. Now, what is epistemology? It's just the branch of philosophy that deals with how we know what we know. You know, how do you know something to be true? That's all it means. You know, knowing, proof, reasons, and evidence and stuff like that. Why don't Christians like it? Well, there are three reasons I wanted to write down. There could be other reasons, but three ones that I wanted to take time to write down. Number one, why do I need to prove that my faith is true when I already believe it? I mean, people came to Christ and now they're going to learn why it's true, and they feel like there's a disconnect there. And they feel like, I'll say, what? Number two, I don't want to go around debating people into God's kingdom. I'm here to love people. And so they say, I don't want to, there's no point to apologetics. In other words, this argument says our apologetics is not practical. So they're sitting here giving you apologetic against apologetics, trying to convince you not to do it. But they're saying it's just not practical. It's just useless. It's wonderful, but useless. The first argument, says, why do I need to prove my faith is true when I already believe it? That argument says that it's not useful. I mean, they say that faith must somehow come some other way. Maybe you just believe it because you want to, or a mystical experience with God. But they don't like the idea of trying to, of ever knowing anything about it, or even existing as something to talk about. The second group says, I don't want to go around debating people. I'm here to love people. They're just saying it's useless. The third group says, I'm not confident about the truthfulness of my religion. Apologetics is scary to me to even think about it. And so it's a fear thing, where they think it would be wonderful, but they're just scared. Okay? Now let's look at apologetics in the Bible. We have some narrative examples. A narrative example is just an example where someone did something, and in this case it would be apologetics. So we look at Acts 26:2. Paul says, I consider myself fortunate that is before you, King Agrippa, I'm going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews. Literally, it's that I'm going to make my apologetic today against all the accusations of the Jews. The Greek word is apologia. It's often translated defense. But he's just making his apologia. Alright, Philippians 1:6. He says, the latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm put here in jail for the defense or apologetic of the gospel. Okay, now those are narrative examples, where someone did something, but I mean they're not really a commandment to do it. Is there a commandment in the Bible about apologetics? There is. The mandate for apologetics is called the biblical mandate for apologetics, 1 Peter 3:15. It's a famous verse. It says, but in your heart, it's actually two commandments, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, commandment 1. Commandment 2, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And he goes on, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. Alright, so he says, always being prepared to give an apologetic, to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Okay. Now, I wanted to bring in a quote from Michael Ramsden, and just to set it up, the context of 1 Peter is a persecuted church. In other words, a persecution has broke out. In other words, in Roman culture, it was illegal to be a Christian because you weren't sacrificing to the Roman gods. So that was punishable by death. But sometimes they weren't really out to get Christians most of the time. It was just they were just lawbreakers, just common lawbreakers. But sometimes persecutions would break out where they were like, okay, let's get rid of these Christians. Let's kill a bunch of them. And that's the environment that this letter was written to during a time of persecution. Okay? And Michael Ramsden says this about it. He says, in an environment where sharing your faith can cost you your life, does Peter say, work hard, pray, and keep to yourself and it'll all work out. No. He says that you need to be ready, willing, and able to give an apologetic. Now, to understand, to answer this question, why we do apologetics, what the purpose of it is, what kind of the thought process behind it, not just do it, but what's going on, what are we trying to do with it. We need to understand what is going on with non-Christians and people that don't believe. And the important thing to understand is this: there is no good reason to disbelieve in Jesus. We seem to think that those people over there who don't believe in Jesus, oh, they just don't know the truth. And if they just knew, if we just gave them the gospel information, it'd be wonderful. And they don't know. It's not the answer. Okay? It's obvious there's a God. It's obvious that you need to accept the fact that you're a sinner, and it's obvious you need to be looking out for something. And then Jesus comes to you in the through the calling of the Holy Spirit and calls you directly, and no one gets saved without that. So it's not like you come in and bring special information to the table. And in fact, look what Romans 1:18 says: "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness." So the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Which is kind of he's hinting at where he's going. But the wrath of God, the fact that you're under the wrath of God is revealed, which is the first part of the gospel, which most people reject, that they're under the wrath of God and that they need, a Savior of some sort. They don't accept Jesus because they don't accept a Savior, period. And Paul explains how God is revealing His wrath. He says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." So he's saying it's obvious, there's a good, perfect God, and then your life, and you know how you're not that, and so the wrath, there's the problem. Because you're not meeting the standard. He's saying the standard is obvious to anyone who can see this world. And then he finishes with, "So they are without excuse." And that word that is translated from excuse is apologetic. Yes, apologia in the Greek. So he's saying no one has an apologetic against God. No one can. And his implication is that if they didn't know, they would have an excuse against God. They would not have a good reason, enough evidence. So we need to ask a very simple question. If someone rejects the obvious truth, you look in John 3, Jesus even says, people do not come into the light because they love darkness and hate light. It's not because they don't see the light. So what will you do if you reject the obvious truth? Okay, well, you've believed something absurd. You believed a lie which was absurd because you knew it wasn't true and you just believed it. You decided to self-deceive, and self-deception is probably the most common form of deception. We convince ourselves that dumb things are true all the time. You will do one of two things. You will either A, just become an absurd person and just embrace absurdity and go nuts, or two, you will use intellectual arguments that mount up to nothing more than confusion as a means to make yourself feel smart, wise, right, and ultimately safe for rejecting Jesus. Do you understand? It's ultimately a safety technique. Okay? And these arguments amount to nothing more than intellectual, highfalutin confusion. In logic, we call it a fallacy. A fallacy is when something sounds true, but it actually is not true. It's confusion. Okay? Paul, I cut off in verse 20, but he goes right into verse 21 and says this. He says, "For although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him." Exactly what I was saying, right? "But they became futile in their thinking." Confusion. They willfully mixed themselves up. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Intellectual confusion. Wise, but really foolish. Intellectual confusion. Wise, but really foolish. Okay? They exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So, in other words, people worshipped the creation rather than the Creator. He goes on to say that, which is, all that's left. And it is what people do. So, this confusion, the purpose of apologetics is for you to come in as a Christian and to remove the confusion surrounding the gospel. And it is important to notice this. Sometimes you have people who have willfully self-confused, but sometimes you have people who literally are born into a culture that is rejecting Christ. In other words, for hundreds and thousands of years, it's been a rejection of God. And that confusion is built up into their very traditions of their culture. And apologists will tell you, these are some of the hardest situations to deal with, and they do a lot of work and have found a lot of ways to deal with it. And sometimes it can be a culture that was once Christian but has gotten away from it, but they feel like they are, and you can't convert them to what they already are. Or maybe it's India with over 1 million gods. Or maybe it's the Muslims who think that Jesus would be a second God for them to believe in, and they don't want to believe in more than one God. So you have to deal with those things. That's confusion to be unraveled, unwrapped. And when you unwrap it and unravel it, their safety net is gone. And now they're afraid of what? The light of the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's your goal. To remove the confusion that they have wrapped around the gospel so that they can stop being afraid of it. You want them to be afraid of it again, so you will remove the confusion. Okay. Now let's switch gears and make a final point. This confusion, the wise but foolish, this intellectual confusion, sounds right when you first hear it, and will dupe and fool and trick a lot of Christians into doubting their faith and thinking maybe I was following some sort of make-believe all along. And it makes it a real struggle for them. They have real doubts. What happens? So the confusion that makes the non-Christian on one hand feel safe makes the Christian on the other hand feel afraid. Okay? What will be the result of this confusion making a Christian afraid? Well, first thing that will happen is there will be a decrease or even a complete cutting off in casual religious conversations. In other words, religious conversations come up all the time and can come up all the time because your religion as a Christian has to do with everything in your life. I mean, Jesus is the reason, why you do the things you do if you really follow Him, but you'll try to find a way around that even coming up in the conversation. You'll avoid the conversation, or you just won't talk about it. You just won't talk about the fact that I can't be there tomorrow because I've got church. You'll try to find some way, I've got somewhere to be, or something. Because if you may say I've got church, but you be careful who you say it to. You may be careful who you hang around just so that they won't ask you about your religion. You won't have to talk about it, because if you talk about it with someone who doesn't believe it, they're going to challenge you, right? And they're going to say, "Ooh, what's that?" And you don't want to be challenged because you're not real confident that it's even true. So you avoid them. And what can happen? Well, you can have this burning desire in your heart. And here's the second thing that can happen. You will use the church as a support group for you to talk about your faith as much as you want while you're in the church walls. Or maybe a Bible study. Or maybe some sort of outlet where you get to talk about it and talk about it and talk about it without anyone confronting you or challenging you or putting you down. Because you're not confident in it. But you want to talk about it because you love Jesus. So what do? You find other people who love Jesus too, and you just talk about it with them. Because they won't bother you. Because you're afraid. And because you're afraid, and the people out there, they're not afraid. They're tough. Because they got this awesome intellectual confusion. Okay? And then what happens? Well, the revival preacher comes and tells you need to be evangelized, and the church isn't evangelizing, we're not going out and evangelizing. We need to go tell people about Jesus and share our faith, share our faith, share our faith. And you feel ashamed. So what do? you learn some technique, you get training, and it becomes a very simple, very rudimentary technique. You know, sometimes I mean, this does happen. I'm not saying this is always what happens, but this a lot of times does happen. People learn some simple thing to say or do, and so they just become the man with the hammer. And the man with the hammer, you know, you've heard the story. The man with the hammer, all he has is a hammer. You give him a tool on a job site, and the only tool he has is the hammer. So to the man with the hammer, everything's a nail, and he just goes and just beats everyone and everything like it's a nail, because he's the man with the hammer. He pulls nails out or he beats nails in. But that's all hammers do, and he's the man with the hammer. Well, you become the man with the hammer, and you start to treat every person like they're the same, and like they need the exact same message from you. And when in reality, the confusion people build up can be very unique. You have to talk to them and find out how they hid themselves and put what kind of covering they put over themselves so they wouldn't have to look at the gospel of Jesus Christ. It can be very unique. I mean, a lot of times there's like 4 or 5 different ways, but when you get down to the actual person, there is no one technique. You just need to know your faith, and you need to understand it, and you need to just know what's going on with them, and then you can see how to bring them from where they are to where they need to be, at least where you're not confused anymore. And that is it. I hope this video was helpful to someone somewhere. Thank you, and have a lovely, lovely Saturday.